Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxing History Time. Tonight we begin somewhere cold enough that your breath instantly turns visible somewhere. The ground has gone stiff and uncooperative, and the wind has opinions about every exposed inch of your face. You are standing in a North American winter centuries ago, before weather apps, before synthetic insulation, before anyone could casually complain about the heating bill. You probably will not survive this if you do it wrong. That is not drama, that is just physics and biology having a very firm meeting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with your location and local time. It is always strangely comforting to know where in the dark world you are listening from. Now dim the lights, let your shoulders drop, and imagine the cold settling in as the story quietly carries you forward. You are not alone out here, even though the landscape feels vast and silent. Snow creaks under your feet with that dry, brittle sound that only comes when the temperature is brutally low. The air smells sharp and clean, almost metallic, and every inhale feels like it reaches all the way down into your chest. Somewhere nearby, smoke drifts lazily upward, thin and pale against the darkening sky. That smoke is not a mistake. It is controlled, intentional, and precious. You move closer, guided by instinct and by the faint warmth you can sense more than see. The shelter in front of you does not rise proudly above the ground. It barely announces itself at all. From a distance, it looks like part of the earth itself, a low mound shaped by wind and time. This is the first quiet lesson winter teaches you here. Survival is not about standing out, it is about disappearing just enough. For many Native American communities across North America, winter was not an unexpected visitor. It was a regular demanding guest that arrived every year and expected to be accommodated. One mainstream historical fact that tends to surprise people is that large portions of the continent experienced what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, between roughly the 1300s and 1800s, making winters longer and harsher than many people imagine today. These were not mild seasonal inconveniences, these were life-shaping events. You crouch slightly as you approach the entrance. It is small deliberately, so forcing heat to stay inside rather than escape into the night. As you duck down, the wind suddenly loses its teeth. The roar softens into a distant murmur like the ocean heard from far inland. Inside, the temperature shifts almost immediately. Not warm exactly, but calm, manageable. Your muscles loosen without you even telling them to. The walls around you feel solid. Earth packed thickly, reinforced with wood, grasses, bark, or stone depending on the region. Your fingers brush the surface and come away dry. This is not damp ground. This is carefully chosen soil, selected because it drains well and holds heat. People did not stumble into these designs by accident. Generations tested them with their own bodies. A quirky tidbit that often gets overlooked is that some winter shelters were intentionally built partially below ground, not just for insulation, but to take advantage of geothermal stability. A few feet down, the earth maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round. That means when it is brutally cold outside, the ground itself is comparatively warm. Long before modern engineers talked about passive heating, people were already living it. You hear soft sounds now, breathing, the crackle of a very small fire, maybe the faint scrape of someone shifting on a sleeping platform. Sound behaves differently in here. It does not echo sharply. It feels padded, absorbed by the walls. Even your thoughts seem to slow, as if the shelter is asking you to match its pace. Historians still argue whether these shelters were primarily seasonal, or if some communities use them year-round with modifications. The debate is not just academic, it speaks to how flexible and adaptive these societies were. Some evidence suggests entire villages reorganized themselves for the winter, consolidating people into fewer, sturdier structures. Others point to signs of continual occupation, arguing that the line between seasonal and permanent was far blurrier than we like to categorize. You notice how close everyone is. There is no wasted space. This is not about privacy as modern culture defines it. This is about shared warmth. Bodies generate heat. Together, they create a microclimate that makes survival possible. You become acutely aware of your own presence here, another heat source added to the equation. Outside, the wind continues its relentless work, scouring the landscape, piling snow into drifts that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside time stretches, the fire is kept low, not roaring. Too much flame wastes fuel and creates smoke. The goal is steady, slow warmth. Patience again is part of the architecture. You begin to understand that these shelters are not just physical structures. They are agreements between people and their environment. Take only what you need. Build with what the land offers. Do not fight winter head-on. Sidestep it. Let it pass over you. There is a subtle smell here, a blend of earth smoke, dried plants, and human presence. It's not unpleasant. It is grounding. It tells you that people have lived this way long enough for these scents to mean safety. You settle in, feeling the day's cold slowly release its grip. Fingers tingle as blood returns. Toes ache briefly, then calm. This moment right here is the difference between life and death in a winter landscape. Not heroics, not conquest, just thoughtful design and collective knowledge. As your breathing syncs with the quiet rhythm of the shelter, you realize something else. These winter homes are invisible to history and many popular narratives because they worked too well. They did not leave towering ruins or dramatic monuments. They left survival. And survival, when it is done right, rarely announces itself loudly. The night deepens outside, but you remain held by earth and intention. The cold can wait. You stay where you are, letting the warmth hold you, while outside the winter keeps doing its thing, without asking permission. Morning will come eventually, but winter mornings arrive slowly, reluctantly, as if even the sun would rather stay wrapped up. Before that happens, there is planning to think about, because none of what keeps you safe right now was improvised at the last second. Long before the ground hardened and the rivers began to whisper under their skins of ice, people were already preparing for this exact night. You imagine late autumn air, crisp but not yet cruel leaves dry underfoot, hands busy with tasks that look ordinary until you realize what is at stake. Winter survival here is decided weeks or even months earlier, not when the snow finally falls. A widely accepted historical fact is that many Indigenous communities organize their yearly calendars around seasonal movement and preparation. Harvests were timed not just for abundance, but for storage. Wood was gathered and cut before it became brittle in the cold. Repair work on shelters happened while fingers could still feel what they were doing. You can almost hear the steady rhythm of work, not rushed, but purposeful. You step back into those earlier weeks, mentally walking alongside people who know exactly what winter will demand of them. They check the thickness of hides. They inspect roof beams. They test how water flows away from the shelter during rain, because trapped moisture now would become dangerous ice later. Preparation is not anxious here. It is calm, practiced, almost soothing in its repetition. There is a faint smell of drying meat and stored roots in the air. Smoke curls from small fires used for preservation rather than warmth. The sounds are different too. Less wind, more conversation, laughter even. It might surprise you, but autumn is not a season of dread. It is a season of confidence. People have done this before. Their parents did it. Their grandparents did it. Winter is serious, but it is not a mystery. One quirky detail that often gets missed is that some groups deliberately delayed certain construction tasks until just before winter, believing fresh materials sealed better and stayed more resilient under cold stress. From a modern perspective, that might sound risky. From their perspective, it was fine-tuned experience. Freshly cut wood behaves differently than wood left to dry too long. Timing mattered. You notice how knowledge moves quietly through the community. Elders point things out without long explanations. Younger hands copy what they see. No one is giving a lecture. Survival does not need speeches. It needs consistency. Even children are involved, carrying smaller bundles, learning through touch and repetition. Winter will not be gentle just because someone is young. Historians still argue whether these preparations were driven more by environmental necessity or by cultural tradition that took on its own momentum. Some suggest that rituals and seasonal markers encoded practical information in memorable ways. Others believe the practical needs came first and the symbolic layers followed. Either way, the result was the same. People entered winter ready. As you walk through this imagined autumn, you notice how shelters themselves begin to change. Openings get reinforced. Extra layers are added to walls. Sleeping areas are rearranged to reduce drafts. Everything is slightly tightened, slightly condensed, as if the structure is drawing itself inward in anticipation. Food stores are checked and rechecked. Underground caches are sealed carefully. Baskets are hung from rafters away from curious animals. Even the layout of supplies inside the shelter follows logic. The most calorie-dense foods are kept closest. Accessibility matters when energy is limited. There is a sound you keep hearing, a soft thud of earth being packed down. Soil is tamped firmly against walls, closing gaps, smoothing surfaces. It is quiet work, but deeply satisfying. You can feel the future warmth in each motion. The shelter is not just a place to hide from winter. It is a tool actively shaped to manage it. By the time the first real snow arrives, no one is surprised. The transition feels almost ceremonial. The work shifts indoors. Hands that were busy outside now busy themselves with repair, tool-making, storytelling. The shelter you're sitting in now feels earned. Back in the present moment inside the winter night, you realize how much unseen effort surrounds you. Every layer above your head represents a choice made earlier, a task completed before the cold made it painful. This is the hidden part of survival that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings. The wind outside rises briefly, testing the walls. Nothing shifts. The shelter holds because it was ready long before this moment. You exhale slowly, letting that knowledge settle. Preparation is quiet confidence, and here it is what keeps you alive as the night stretches on. You stay low to the ground as the night deepens, and you begin to notice something almost counterintuitive. The very earth beneath you is doing most of the work. It is not dramatic, it does not glow or crackle, it simply exists, steady and reliable, holding on to heat the way it always has. When you press your palm to the wall, it feels cool, but not biting. There's no sharp sting like exposed stone or frozen wood. This is the quiet power of soil used correctly. One well-established historical fact is that many indigenous winter shelters across North America relied on thick earthen walls because soil has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, creating a stable interior temperature even when conditions outside swing wildly. You shift slightly and feel the floor beneath you. Packed dirt, sometimes layered with grasses, reeds, or mats. It does not feel luxurious by our modern standards, but it feels intentional. Every material here was chosen because it behaved predictably in winter. Unpredictability is dangerous when the cold can kill you in hours. Outside, the wind scrapes across the surface of the land, but down here it cannot reach you. Earth blocks airflow completely. No drafts sneak in through the walls. The shelter feels tucked into the planet itself, as if you are borrowing warmth directly from the ground. A small fire flickers nearby, its light dancing gently against the curved walls. The heat from that fire does not vanish upward. It spreads slowly, absorbed by the soil stored like a battery. Hours from now, even after the fire has died down, the walls will still be giving that warmth back. This is not accidental. People learned long ago that fire and earth work best together when you let them cooperate rather than compete. There is a faint, comforting smell of warm dirt, something you probably have not noticed much in your modern life. It is the smell of stability, of insulation, of not freezing. A lesser-known but fascinating detail is that some communities intentionally mixed organic materials like straw grass or even crushed shells into their earthen walls. This made the structure lighter, more flexible, and better at resisting cracks during freeze and thaw cycles. It is not unlike the way modern builders add rebar or fibre to concrete. The idea is the same: strength through mixture. You adjust your position, leaning into the curve of the wall. Straight corners are rare here. Curves distribute stress more evenly. Snow loads press down from above, but the rounded shape redirects that pressure outward and into the ground. The shelter feels like it is hugging in itself. Historians still argue whether the choice of circular or oval shapes was primarily structural or symbolic. Some scholars point to engineering efficiency. Others suggest that cultural ideas about cycles, seasons, and continuity influence design. As with many things, the truth is probably both. Practical needs and meaning often grow together. The silence inside deepens. You hear less now. The world outside feels distant, muted. Even the fire seems quieter, its crackle softened by the earth around it. Sound like heat is being absorbed and held. You begin to understand how different this feels from a wooden cabin or a stone house. Those structures fight the cold by standing against it. This one avoids the fight entirely. It steps aside, lets winter rage overhead, and remains calm underneath. Your breathing slows. There is something deeply settling about being partially underground. Modern studies show that humans often feel calmer in enclosed sheltered spaces, especially when they are quiet and dimly lit. You do not need a study to tell you that right now. Your body already knows. Another detail emerges as you watch the fire. Smoke does not billow chaotically. It rises steadily toward a small opening above, guided by the shape of the roof. That opening is carefully sized. Too big and heat escapes. Too small and smoke lingers. Generations refined that balance. The earth above you is heavy with snow now. Ironically, that weight helps. Snow acts as additional insulation, trapping pockets of air that further slow heat loss. You are warmer because of the storm, not in spite of it. You think about how little of this is visible from the outside. A passing traveller might see nothing but a snow-covered mound and move on, never realising life continues quietly below. Survival here is subtle. As you wet is supported by air, soil and shared warmth of the lesson sinks in. The earth is not just the ground you walk on. Used wisely, it becomes walls, insulation, protection. Tonight, it is the difference between enduring winter and becoming part of it. You move closer to the centre of the shelter, and now you finally notice the opening in the floor. It is not a hole in the careless sense. It is deliberate, smooth around the edges, worn soft by countless hands and feet. A sturdy ladder rises from it, simple but dependable. This is how you came down, and this is how people have been coming home for generations. These are pit houses, though the name sounds far less thoughtful than the reality. You lower yourself again, feeling how the temperature shifts with each rung. Above ground, even just a little higher, the air bites harder. Down here, the cold loosens its grip. This vertical difference of a few feet can mean everything when the wind is sharp enough to steal heat from exposed skin in minutes. Archaeological findings across regions like the Columbia Plateau in the southwest show that pit houses were especially common in colder months. These were not primitive experiments. They were highly tuned responses to winter conditions refined over centuries. Some could house extended families, while others served as communal spaces where multiple households gathered when temperatures dropped dangerously low. As you stand at the bottom, the ladder above you no longer feels like an exit. It feels like a boundary between worlds. Up there is exposure, down here is control. The entrance itself acts as a cold trap. Heavy air sinks, lighter, warm air stays below. Cold drafts hesitate, then stop. There is an unexpected quietness to this space. Wind does not howl, snow does not hiss. Instead, you hear soft human sounds. A cough, a murmur, the gentle shift of someone settling in for the night. These are the sounds of survival happening without urgency. A detail that often surprises people is that many pit houses were partially dismantled or allowed to collapse after winter ended. The materials would be reused or returned to the land. These structures were not meant to dominate the landscape permanently. They were seasonal companions, not monuments. The idea of rebuilding each year might sound exhausting to modern ears, but It allowed designs to adapt constantly to changing needs. You notice the roof structure above. Beams arranged carefully supporting layers of brush grass and earth. The weight is significant but evenly distributed. Snow piles on top without crushing the space below. The shape matters here. Flat roofs would fail. Sloped or dome design shed stress gradually. Some researchers believe that the depth of these pit houses varied depending on how severe winters were expected to be in a given decade. There is evidence suggesting deeper constructions during colder climatic periods. Others question whether depth had more to do with soil stability and water drainage. The truth likely shifts from place to place, shaped by local knowledge rather than a single rule. You feel how the space holds warmth differently than earlier shelters you imagined. Heat pools gently near the floor, then rises slowly. People sit, sleep and work where warmth naturally gathers. Nothing here wastes energy. There is a faint earthy scent mixed with smoke, but it does not sting your eyes. Smoke management was critical. Fire pits were shallow, carefully positioned. Roof openings were aligned not just vertically, but with prevailing winter wind patterns to encourage steady airflow. This kind of environmental awareness does not come from theory. It comes from long memory. An often overlooked detail is that pit houses also offered protection beyond temperature. During winter, storms blowing snow can disorient travelers completely. These homes sat low, nearly invisible once snow covered them. While this reduced visibility to outsiders, it also reduced exposure to relentless wind abrasion that can strip heat rapidly from structures above ground. You imagine stepping outside during a blizzard. The world would be white and roaring. Finding this entrance again would require familiarity, memory, maybe even known markers placed before snowfall. Winter demanded attention even from those well prepared. Inside again, your shoulders relax. The walls curve gently inward. There are no sharp corners to catch heat or sound. Everything feels contained. You begin to sense how living in this space would shape daily rhythms. Movement is slower. Gestures are economical. Energy is conserved without conscious effort. There is discussion among scholars about whether pit houses also carried social meaning beyond practicality. Some interpret their inward-facing design as reinforcing community bonds during winter isolation. Others argue that social practices adapted to architecture, not the other way around. Either way, proximity changes how people relate to one another. Winter does not allow distance. You shift your weight and feel the packed earth beneath you remain firm. No creaks, no flexing. This ground has been prepared as carefully as any modern foundation. Stones may be layered beneath drainage channels carved invisibly below the surface. Water infiltration would be disastrous once freezing began. As the fire dims slightly, the walls continue to radiate stored warmth. This delayed release is what makes sleep possible. You are not chasing heat all night. You are borrowing it steadily from the shelter itself. The ladder above casts a soft shadow. It reminds you that daylight and movement still exist, but they are not needed right now. The pit house is enough. It is quiet proof that sometimes the smartest way to survive winter is not to rise above it, but to step gently below and let the earth do the rest. You remain inside, letting the pit house hold its steady temperature, and now your attention drifts to the walls themselves. They are not bare earth alone. They are layered, textured, and quietly busy doing their job. When you look closely, you can see where bark overlaps soil, where brush is pressed tight beneath packed dirt, where reeds and grasses create thin pockets of trapped air. These walls breathe in a way modern materials rarely do. Ethnographic records and excavation studies show that many indigenous winter shelters used multi-layer construction specifically to manage moisture as well as heat. Dry walls are warm walls. Wet walls steal heat from bodies at an alarming rate. Everything here is arranged to avoid that mistake. Water is guided away, absorbed where it should be, and released gradually when conditions allow. You run your fingers lightly across a section of wall and feel how it gives just a little. Not weak, but flexible. That flexibility matters when temperatures swing above and below freezing. Rigid structures crack. These adapt. They expand, contract, and settle without failing. It is a lesson engineers still chase today. An unusual detail that tends to surprise people is that bark was often chosen not just because it was available, but because it resists rot and sheds water even after long exposure. Certain tree species were preferred for this reason, and people knew exactly which stands to harvest from without killing the source. Material science lived in memory rather than textbooks. The smell inside the shelter shifts slightly as the fire warms the air. You catch hints of resin, dried leaves, and smoke that clings gently to organic fibres. It is not suffocating. It is familiar. Walls made of living materials respond to heat differently than stone or brick. They soften sound, moderate humidity, and feel less hostile to bare skin. You lean back and notice how little condensation forms. Breathing bodies produce moisture. In a sealed space, that moisture can freeze onto surfaces and drip back down as icy water. These walls prevent that. Air exchange is subtle but constant. Small gaps between layers allow vapor to move without inviting drafts. Researchers continue to disagree about whether this ventilation was fully intentional or an emergent benefit of organic construction. Some argue that the behavior of these materials was observed and refined over generations. Others suggest people simply used what worked and learned through outcome rather than theory. Either way, the result was a remarkably comfortable interior during extreme cold. You listen to the soft rustle of someone shifting nearby, the sound dampened by fibrous walls. Even voices would not carry sharply here. Privacy in winter shelters often came from sound absorption rather than physical separation. Conversations stayed close. The shelter created intimacy by default. There is another advantage to these layered walls that becomes clear when you imagine the outside world. Predators, strong winds, even heavy snowfall. Bark and brush break up airflow before it ever reaches the earthen core. This reduces erosion and helps the structure last through the season. Each layer protects the next. Some early European observers wrote dismissively about what they saw as crude construction, not realizing how advanced these designs were for their environment. That misunderstanding lingered far too long. Modern testing of similar organic insulation shows thermal performance that rivals or exceeds some industrial materials, especially when moisture control is considered. You feel the wall behind you radiating a gentle warmth now, not from the fire directly, but from stored heat slowly releasing. This delayed exchange is what keeps temperatures from spiking and crashing. Stability is everything in winter. There is discussion among historians about how much variation existed between families within the same community. Some evidence suggests individual households customized wall thickness or material combinations based on experience or preference. Others see more standardized designs implying shared norms and communal building efforts. Both could be true at different times. As the night progresses, the walls do not creak or groan. They remain quiet even under the weight of snow accumulating above. You're insulated not just from cold but from the chaos of weather itself. Your breathing slows again, matching the slow exchange of heat and air around you. These walls are not passive barriers. They are active systems balancing warmth, moisture and sound with calm efficiency. It becomes clear that survival here is not about overpowering nature. It is about cooperating with it at every level. Bark, brush, soil and human knowledge woven together into something that feels alive. You rest against it, trusting that while winter does its worst, outside the walls will continue doing exactly what they were designed to do. You sense the weight above you long before you think about it directly. Snow has been falling steadily, layer after layer, settling onto the shelter. Instinct might tell you that this is dangerous, that the growing mass overhead should make you uneasy. Instead, it does the opposite. The shelter feels warmer now, more cocooned, more complete. Field studies and indigenous knowledge alike show that snow is one of the most effective natural insulators available. It traps air in countless tiny pockets, slowing the movement of heat. Once a shelter is buried under a thick blanket of snow, temperature fluctuations drop dramatically. Inside, conditions stabilize while the outside world grows harsher. You picture the snow outside absorbing sound, softening the landscape into a quiet white expanse. Wind loses its sharp edge. Even storms feel muffled. The shelter benefits from all of this. The snow is not an enemy. It is an ally that arrives on time every year. There is a little known but fascinating practice where people would intentionally shovel snow against the sides of their winter homes after major storms. From the outside it looked like abandonment. In reality it was reinforcement. More snow meant better insulation and fewer gaps for wind to exploit. The shelter became harder to find but easier to live in. You adjust your position and feel the warmth linger around you longer than before. The fire has been low for some time now, yet the air remains comfortable. Heat that would normally escape into the night is now held in place by layers of earth and snow working together. Some researchers point out that this practice required deep trust in structural design. A poorly built shelter would collapse under heavy snow loads. The fact that people confidently added more weight speaks volumes about how well these homes were engineered. Failure in winter was not an option. There is still discussion among experts about how much snow accumulation was considered ideal. Too little and insulation suffered. Too much and entrances risk being blocked. Some believe regular clearing of entryways was essential, while others suggest alternate ventilation paths were maintained to ensure airflow, even when doorways were buried. You imagine stepping outside briefly during a storm as the snow stings your face. Visibility shrinks to a few steps. Returning to the shelter, you would brush snow from your shoulders and slide back inside, sealing warmth behind you. That moment of transition would feel profound every time. Inside, the light grows softer as snow filters what little glow escapes from the fire opening. The shelter feels darker but calmer. Darkness here is not threatening, it is protective. The world is narrow to this space, this breath, this shared warmth. An overlooked detail is how snow also helped regulate humidity. Cold, dry air outside meets warmer, moist air inside, and the snow layer buffers that exchange. The result is fewer drafts and less condensation forming on interior surfaces. Again, the shelter benefits from something that seems, at first glance, hostile. You listen to the faint sound of snow settling above, a gentle whisper rather than a crash. It is almost lulling. Winter asserts itself, but in doing so it strengthens the shelter rather than weakening it. There remains some disagreement about whether these practices were universally applied or adapted only in certain regions with heavy snowfall. Evidence varies, but oral histories consistently emphasize snow as protection rather than threat. Experience taught people to read winter accurately, not fearfully. You settle deeper, letting that understanding sink in. Survival here is about reframing. Snow is not just cold, it is cover. It is insulation, it is silence. As the storm continues, the shelter feels increasingly separate from the chaos outside. You are wrapped in layers of intention material and season itself. Snow keeps falling, doing exactly what it needs to do. And inside you remain warm, breathing, slowly held safely beneath it all. You begin to notice how the space around you changes when more people settle in for the night. The shelter does not feel crowded. It feels activated. Bodies shift, blankets rustle softly, and warmth increases in a way that feels almost organic. This is winter living scaled for community rather than isolation. Longhouses across the northeastern woodlands offer one of the clearest examples of this adaptation. During colder months, families gathered more tightly, closing off unused sections and reinforcing walls to retain heat. Excavated sites and early descriptions confirm that winter arrangements looked very different from summer layouts. Space was flexible, responsive to temperature rather than rigid tradition. You imagine moving through such a structure. The ceiling arches overhead, beams darkened by years of smoke. The air smells of wood-dried food and human presence. Fires burn at intervals carefully managed so that heat spreads without turning the interior into a choking haze. Smoke rises toward openings above, finding its way out slowly, patiently. There is a subtle rhythm to it all. People wake and sleep according to light and warmth rather than clocks, At night, the longhouse becomes quieter, but never silent. The sound of breathing, the occasional murmur, the gentle pop of embers create a background that feels steady and reassuring. One detail often missed in modern retellings is that winter longhouses were not just about staying warm, they were about staying together. Cold months, reduced travel and limited hunting opportunities. Gathering indoors reinforced social bonds, shared labour and collective care. Warmth came from closeness as much as from fire. You feel how the heat behaves differently here than in smaller shelters. It moves laterally as well as upward, shared across the length of the space. Sleeping platforms are raised, keeping bodies above the coldest air near the floor. Furs and woven mats add another layer, trapping warmth close to skin. Some interpretations suggest that winter crowding led to increased illness, while others point out that these communities develop practices to manage health risks, including ventilation control and fire placement. The evidence does not settle neatly, reminding you that survival always involves trade-offs rather than perfect solutions. As you lie back, you notice how the walls seem thicker in winter sections. Additional bark panels or woven screens are added, closing gaps that would be welcome in summer, but dangerous now. Openings shrink. Entrances are buffered with windbreaks. The building itself seems to inhale and exhale with the seasons. There is something deeply calming about this shared environment. Modern life often equates comfort with privacy, but here comfort comes from presence. You're not alone with the cold, you're part of a warm, breathing group. Sound behaves differently in the longhouse too. It travels along the length of the structure but remains softened by organic materials. Conversations fade gradually rather than cutting off sharply. Even silence feels communal. Accounts passed down through oral history describe winter nights filled with storytelling, quiet teaching, and gentle humour. Laughter did not disappear just because it was cold. In fact, it may have mattered more. Stories passed the time, preserved knowledge, and kept minds engaged while bodies rested. There is still no single explanation for how longhouses evolved into their winter forms. Some researchers emphasize environmental pressures, while others highlight social organization as the driving force. It is likely that both shaped each other continuously. You shift slightly, adjusting your position on the platform. The warmth beneath you is steady now. Fires are low. Snow presses against the outer walls, adding its own insulating layer. The longhouse holds not just heat, but people, routines, and memory. Outside winter stretches endlessly. Inside time slows, shared and steady. You close your eyes knowing that morning will come, but not rushing it. For now, warmth and togetherness are enough. You become aware of the fire before you really look at it. Not the flames themselves, but the way the air feels around them, gentle, controlled. Nothing like the roaring blazes people imagine when they think about keeping warm. In winter shelters, fire is a careful companion never allowed to dominate the space. Across many regions, evidence shows that indoor fires during winter were kept deliberately small and slow burning. Large fires waste fuel and create dangerous smoke buildup. Instead, people favoured steady embers that radiated heat over long periods. Ash layers found in ancient hearths suggest frequent tending rather than dramatic flare-ups. You sit close enough to feel warmth on your hands without feeling your skin dry out. The fire smells of wood chosen for its burn qualities. Some woods crack and spark too much. Others smoke excessively. People learned which fuels behaved best in enclosed spaces, and they used them sparingly. An often overlooked practice involved positioning the hearth slightly off-centre. This allowed heat to circulate more evenly and prevented one side of the shelter from overheating while the other stayed cold. It also reduced the risk of sparks reaching bedding or stored materials. Small adjustments like this made a significant difference over long nights. Your eyes follow the thin ribbon of smoke as it rises. It does not rush. It drifts upward, guided by the shape of the roof and the placement of the opening above. That opening is carefully sized. Too wide and precious warmth escapes. Too narrow and smoke lingers where lungs do not appreciate it. There remains some uncertainty about how early builders determined ideal smoke hole dimensions. Some believe this knowledge was passed down through demonstration and correction. Others think experimentation played a role with designs refined over generations based on comfort and survival outcomes. Either way, the result feels balanced. You notice how the fire sound changes as fuel shifts from wood to embers. The crackle softens into a quiet hum. It is almost hypnotic. The shelter absorbs the noise, turning it into background rhythm rather than disruption. Fire management also shapes daily routines. Someone always knew when to feed the hearth, when to let it rest, when to clear ash. These tasks rotated, shared, and rarely called attention to themselves. Winter survival depended on consistency more than heroics. There is a lesser-known detail about ash itself. Instead of being discarded immediately, warm ash was sometimes spread thinly in specific areas to help dry damp spots or stabilize flooring. Even waste heat found a purpose. You shift your feet closer, then pause. You do not want to disturb the balance. Too close and you overheat. Too far and the chill creeps back. The sweet spot is then not measured. Accounts from early observers often misunderstood this restraint, interpreting small fires as signs of scarcity or hardship. In reality, they reflected efficiency. Fuel gathered in autumn had to last. Burning slowly was a sign of foresight, not lack. Some interpretations differ on how much fire was used overnight. Did people let fires burn continuously, or did they rely more on stored heat from walls and bedding? Evidence points to variation shaped by fuel availability and shelter design, rather than a single rule. As the embers glow, shadows ripple gently across the walls. The movement is slow enough to relax your eyes. Heat seeps into the earth around the hearth to be released hours later, when the fire dims further. You breathe in, carefully. The air is warm but not heavy. Smoke does not cling. This balance took generations to master. Outside, winter continues its relentless sweep. Inside, the fire does not fight it. It complements it. A quiet glow in a dark season, carefully managed, patiently tended, and never allowed to burn more than necessary. As the night stretches on, attention shifts from fire to rest. You notice how sleeping here is not an afterthought, but a carefully designed part of winter survival. Where and how you lie down matters almost as much as the shelter itself. Raised sleeping platforms line parts of the interior, lifted just enough to escape the coldest air that settles near the ground. Archaeological remains and preserved accounts show that these platforms were common in winter dwellings, often built from wood frames covered with woven mats, grasses, and thick furs. Elevation was a simple but effective strategy. You climb onto one, slowly feeling how the surface holds your weight without sagging. Beneath the layers, air is trapped, forming another insulating barrier. The difference is immediate. Your back relaxes as warmth gathers instead of draining away. People rarely slept alone here. Shared bedding was common, especially during the coldest months. Body heat was a resource just like firewood or stored food. There is nothing awkward about it in this context. It is practical, familiar, and reassuring. A detail that surprises many is how sleeping positions were adjusted with the seasons. In winter, people tended to curl slightly, or sleep closer together to reduce exposed surface area. In warmer months, spacing increased. Comfort was dynamic, not fixed. You notice the quiet rustle of blankets, the soft breathing nearby. The shelter seems to encourage stillness. Movement slows, even thoughts feel heavier, settling into a calmer rhythm. Some scholars suggest that raised platforms also helped protect sleepers from insects and dampness even in winter. Others believe their primary purpose was thermal regulation. Both explanations likely overlap, reflecting how solutions often addressed multiple needs at once. The materials around you smell faintly of smoke and animal hide. These scents linger not because of neglect, but because they contribute to preservation. Smoke discourages pests and slows decay. Winter shelters carried their own protective atmosphere. You adjust your position and feel the warmth beneath you persist. The walls continue to release stored heat, and bodies nearby add to it. Fire is no longer the main source, the shelter itself has taken over. Early observers sometimes describe these sleeping arrangements with discomfort, interpreting closeness as lack of sophistication. That perspective misses the point entirely. Privacy loses its value when warmth and survival take precedence. Here, closeness is kindness. There is ongoing discussion about how sleep patterns shifted during long winter nights. Some evidence suggests segmented sleep with periods of rest broken by quiet activity near the hearth. Others interpret winter as a time of extended sleep conserving energy. The truth likely varied by community and circumstance. You imagine waking briefly in the middle of the night, feeding the fire if needed, sharing a few words, then settling back in. Time feels flexible, darkness does not demand prolonged activities. The platform creaks softly as someone shifts. No one minds. Sound is muted, absorbed by layered walls and bodies. Even disturbance feels gentle. As your breathing deepens, the shelter feels more alive than before. Heat circulates slowly, predictably. The cold outside remains distant, almost theoretical. You realize that sleep here is not escape, it is participation. Rest is part of the system that keeps everyone alive through winter. You close your eyes, trusting the platform, the shelter, and the people around you to hold steady until morning. As you rest half awake and half drifting, you start to notice how clothing and shelter work together as a single system. Nothing here operates alone. The warmth holding you now is not just from walls or shared bodies. It is layered directly onto you, moving with you, breathing when you breathe. Winter clothing in these communities was built for long indoor hours as much as for short trips into the cold. Garments were soft, flexible, and designed to trap heat without restricting movement. Animal hides were scraped thin and worked carefully so they insulated without becoming stiff. You can feel the difference immediately when you shift. The fabric moves with you instead of fighting you. People often wore multiple light layers rather than one heavy piece. This allowed heat to be adjusted as needed. Near the fire, outer layers could be loosened. When stepping outside briefly, everything tightened again. This adaptability mattered. Overheating indoors could be just as dangerous as freezing outdoors, especially when sweat cooled too quickly. You run your fingers along the edge of a sleeve and notice faint stitching marks. Every seam matters. Poorly sewn clothing lets cold air slip in and warmth leak out. These garments were not rushed. They were winter tools made by hands that understood consequences. A lesser discussed detail is how sleeping clothing differed from daytime wear. Some layers were reserved specifically for rest, kept dry and clean to maximize warmth at night. Damp clothing steals heat aggressively. Protecting sleep layers was a priority woven into daily habits. You think about how the shelter itself complements this. There is no sharp surface heat to pull heat from your body. Walls are forgiving, floors are layered. Even sitting against a wall does not drain warmth the way stone or metal would. The environment supports what clothing begins. Early accounts sometimes misinterpreted this system, assuming heavy furs meant constant discomfort or excess. In reality, people regulated temperature with surprising precision. They understood that comfort in winter is not about extreme heat, but about avoiding sudden loss. Some interpretations suggest that certain garments doubled as bedding, blurring the line between clothing and shelter. Others see clearer separation between what was worn and what was laid beneath sleepers. Evidence varies by region, reminding you again that winter solutions were never one size fits all. You notice how quiet the space remains as people settle. Fabric muffles sound, movement soften. Clothing absorbs small noises just as walls absorb echoes. The shelter becomes quieter as layers accumulate. There is also an emotional comfort here that is easy to miss. Familiar textures against skin matter when days are dark and long. The smell of worked hide smoke and earth signals safety. Winter is endured not just physically but mentally. You adjust your position again and feel heat remain where you leave it, not vanish instantly. That is the combined effect of insulation on skin and insulation in space. The system works because every part supports the others. Outside temperatures continue to drop. Inside no one panics. Clothing has already done its job. The shelter holds, bodies rest. As sleep deepens, you no longer think about layers or seams. They fade into background trust. Winter becomes something happening elsewhere while you remain wrapped, supported and steady. You wake just enough to notice the air moving, and then you realize it is barely moving at all. That is not accidental. Where this shelter sits was chosen with care long before the first wall was shaped. Wind is the most aggressive thief of warmth, and avoiding it begins outside, not inside. You imagine standing here before the shelter was built during a colder season long past. People would have watched how snow drifted, how smoke bent, how trees leaned after storms. Valleys that look peaceful in summer can become wind tunnels in winter. Hilltops invite exposure, low spots collect cold air. The right place is often slightly raised, tucked just enough to avoid flooding, but shielded from prevailing gusts. Material evidence from winter habitation sites shows consistent patterns. Entrances often face away from dominant winter winds. Natural barriers like ridges, tree lines, or rock outcrops are used as shields. Even a small rise in the land can make the difference between manageable cold and relentless exposure. You feel how calm it is here. The shelter does not shudder or whistle. Wind slides over and around rather than pushing directly against walls. Snow piles gently instead of scouring surfaces bare. The land itself is participating in your protection. One detail that rarely gets attention is how entrances were sometimes angled or extended through short passageways. These acted like buffers, trapping cold air before it could reach the main living space. Stepping inside was a gradual transition rather than an abrupt shock. Cold stayed near the ground, warmth stayed where people were. You picture someone returning from outside, brushing snow from their clothing before ducking in. That brief moment in the entry space allows cold air to settle harmlessly. The inner area remains undisturbed. It is subtle design, but it matters every single time the door opens. There is still uncertainty about how standardized these placement choices were across different communities. Some sites suggest highly consistent orientation, while others show more variation. Local geography likely guided decisions more than strict rules. What worked in one valley might fail completely in another. Inside, the effect is unmistakable. Fire heat stays centered. Walls do not leak drafts. Even the smoke hole above behaves predictably because airflow is steady rather than chaotic. Calm air is easier to manage than turbulent air. You listen closely. No howling, no sudden pressure changes. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you rest without bracing yourself. You realize that winter survival begins long before the first snowflake falls. It begins with observation, with paying attention year after year. The land teaches if you watch long enough. There is a tendency in modern thinking to separate architecture from environment as if buildings exist independently of their surroundings. Here that separation never existed. Shelter and landscape are part of the same solution. Some interpretations suggest that sacred or cultural considerations also influence placement, not just weather. Certain locations held meaning beyond practicality. Others believe survival concerns dominated winter decisions. Both could be true. Meaning and necessity often overlap rather than compete. As you settle back into stillness, you feel grateful for choices made long before you arrived. Someone noticed how wind bent the grass here. Someone remembered which storms were worst. Someone chose this exact spot because winter had proven it kind enough. Outside, wind moves across the land, but it does not reach you. Inside, warmth lingers without effort. The shelter rests where it belongs, and so do you. The calm you feel now makes it easy to forget that winter does not always behave predictably. Even the best prepared people knew that some seasons arrived with surprises. Ice storms, sudden thaws, followed by deep freezes, or snowfall so heavy it changed familiar paths. These moments tested shelters in ways no planning could fully anticipate. You imagine one of those nights, the air thick with moisture instead of crisp snow falling heavier than expected, branches snapping under the weight. The sound outside is wrong, deeper and more chaotic. Ice coats everything it touches, sealing surfaces smooth and unforgiving. This is when winter stops following the usual script. Inside the shelter, the response is immediate but measured. Fires are adjusted, not intensified. Too much heat would melt snow against walls and roofs, leading to moisture that could freeze later. Instead, warmth is kept steady. People listen. They feel for changes in temperature and airflow, rather than reacting emotionally. Traces found at some winter sites suggest that shelters were occasionally modified mid-season, extra layers added to walls, roof openings narrowed temporarily, entryways reinforced with additional barriers. These changes were not signs of failure, they were evidence of flexibility. Shelters were living structures meant to adapt when conditions demanded it. You feel how the air inside stays relatively stable even as the storm intensifies outside. Sound changes again. Ice storms produce a constant unsettling noise as branches crack and frozen rain strikes surfaces. Inside that chaos is dulled, softened by earth and snow. A lesser-known practice involved redirecting meltwater during brief warm spells. Small channels carved into packed earth floors guided moisture away from sleeping areas and toward drainage points. These channels were subtle, easy to miss once dry, but essential during sudden thaws. Water management mattered just as much as insulation. You imagined someone kneeling near the wall, checking for dampness with bare fingers. Moisture meant action. Dry walls meant safety. Knowledge of how water behaved in freezing conditions was learned early and never ignored. There is still debate about how often such extreme events occurred compared to more predictable winter patterns. Climate records reconstructed from tree rings and ice cores suggest periods of increased volatility. Oral histories often remember specific winters as exceptional, passed down precisely because they broke expectations. Inside the shelter, those memories mattered. Stories of past winters guided present decisions. If elders recalled ice storms collapsing weaker roofs decades earlier, designs would quietly change. Reinforcement would be added long before trouble arrived. You feel the shelter hold firm. Snow piles higher outside, pressing against walls, sealing gaps even further. What could be dangerous above ground becomes protective below. The weight feels reassuring rather than threatening. Someone near you shifts, checking the fire. Embers glow steadily. No panic. Winter emergencies here are handled with restraint, not urgency. Movement remains economical. Energy is conserved. You think about how different this feels from modern responses to storms filled with alarms forecasts and constant updates. Here, attention is inward. People rely on sensation and experience rather than prediction. They feel when something changes. In extreme cold snaps, shelters could be temporarily closed almost completely. Ventilation reduced to the minimum needed for breathing. Fires allowed to die lower than usual, relying on stored heat instead. Bodies cluster closer. Stillness increases. The shelter becomes a sealed pocket of life beneath the storm. Some interpretations suggest that these periods of enforced closeness strengthen social bonds. Others note the potential for tension in confined spaces. Both are likely true. Winter does not idealize human behavior. It amplifies it. You notice how sound carries differently now. Even breathing feels louder in the quiet. The storm outside creates a distant pressure, but inside remains controlled. At some point the storm begins to ease. Ice stops striking surfaces. Wind slackens. Snow settles into stillness. Inside, no one rushes to celebrate. Winter has taught patience. Stability is confirmed over hours, not moments. When someone eventually steps outside to check conditions, they move carefully, deliberately. The world has changed shape overnight. Familiar paths are gone, landmarks buried. Returning safely matters more than curiosity. Inside again, warmth remains. The shelter did what it was meant to do. It absorbed stress, adapted quietly, and protected without drama. As you settle back, the lesson becomes clear. Winter survival was never about eliminating risk. It was about designing spaces that could respond when winter behaved unexpectedly. Flexibility, restraint, and shared awareness made the difference. The storm passes, the shelter remains. You breathe slowly, letting calm return, fully knowing that even when winter misbehaves, you are not unprepared. You begin to notice how the shelter changes depending on who is inside it. Not in shape or size, but in focus. Certain areas feel more protected, more carefully arranged. These are not random choices. They reflect priorities shaped by experience and responsibility. Children sleep closer to the warmest parts of the shelter. Elders do too, though often for different reasons. Young bodies lose heat faster. Older bodies struggle to regulate temperature. Winter exposes those vulnerabilities quickly, and the shelter responds by centering care where it is needed most. You imagine a child stirring in the night, instinctively pulling a blanket tighter. Someone nearby adjusts it without fully waking. This happens quietly, almost automatically. The shelter encourages attentiveness. You're always aware of who's around you, even when resting. In many winter dwellings, sleeping arrangements place those most at risk away from entryways and closer to shared heat sources. Raised platforms and thicker bedding were reserved for them. This was not hierarchy. It was practicality guided by care. You feel how the space subtly guides movement. Paths are clear and unobstructed. No one has to step over sleeping forms unnecessarily. Nighttime movement is slow and deliberate. A stumble in winter can mean injury, and injury can mean serious trouble when travel is limited. There is a sense that the shelter itself holds memory. It knows where people should be. It has been arranged this way before. Each winter reinforces patterns that worked and quietly discards those that did not. An often overlooked detail is how elders carried knowledge essential to the shelter's function. They remembered which walls needed reinforcement, which materials lasted longest, which storms came with which winds. Their presence near the centre of the shelter was not just for warmth, it was strategic. Children in turn absorbed this information without formal instruction. They learned by watching where people sat, how fires were tended, how voices lowered at night. Winter taught through immersion rather than explanation. Some interpretations suggest that these spatial arrangements reinforce social bonds and respect across generations. Others view them simply as efficient responses to vulnerability. Both views fit comfortably together. Care and efficiency are not opposites here. You notice how calm the shelter feels despite the closeness. There is no sense of crowding. Everyone knows where they belong. That knowledge reduces friction. Winter does not leave room for constant negotiation. The quiet routines continue through the night. Someone checks on a child. Someone shifts closer to an elder. These movements are small, almost invisible, but they accumulate into safety. You realize that protection in winter was never just about walls and fire. It was about attention, about noticing small changes in breathing posture temperature. The shelter made that possible by keeping everyone within reach. As the hours pass, the fire dims further. The walls release stored warmth. Bodies cluster naturally. The cold outside feels distant again. You settle deeper into stillness, aware now that survival here is collective. No one endures winter alone. The shelter does not protect individuals, it protects relationships. When morning eventually arrives, it will do so gently filtered through snow and smoke. For now the night holds. Children sleep soundly. Elders rest. The shelter breathes quietly around them, all doing exactly what it was meant to do. As the night thins and your thoughts drift, your attention moves away from people and fire and settles on what keeps everyone fed when the land outside offers nothing fresh. Winter is not survived on warmth alone. Calories matter. Energy is stored as carefully as heat hidden, just as thoughtfully beneath frozen ground. You imagine stepping outside before the first hard freeze when the soil was still workable. Hands dig steadily, shaping pits deep enough to stay cold but not exposed. These caches are lined with bark, stone, or woven material depending on what the land offers. The goal is simple. Keep food safe from moisture animals and spoilage. Inside the shelter now, you can sense where some of these stores lie. Not visible, not obvious, but known. People move towards certain spots with confidence. They do not fumble, they remember. Memory is part of storage. Evidence from excavated winter sites shows carefully arranged food remains clustered in specific zones. Dried meat, smoked fish, preserved roots and nuts appear together protected from dampness and pests. These were not random piles. They followed patterns refined through trial and loss. You picture a cache being opened during winter. The sound is muted. Frozen soil cracks softly as it is uncovered. The smell that escapes is concentrated, rich, promising. Food here is dense. Every bite counts. One detail that often escapes attention is how storage locations were chosen to avoid temperature swings. Too close to the surface and food freezes and thaws repeatedly. Too deep and moisture becomes a problem. The right depth keeps contents cold but stable, a quiet balance struck long before modern refrigeration. Inside the shelter, portions are measured carefully, not with scales but with experience. Winter meals are steady rather than abundant, overeating now risks shortages later. Hunger is managed, not indulged. You notice how food preparation is slower at night. Movements are deliberate, no one rushes. Energy conservation extends to every action. Even chewing feels slow or intentional. Some remains suggest that certain foods were reserved specifically for the harshest part of winter. These were not daily staples, they were insurance. Consuming them too early would be a mistake remembered painfully later. There is a gentle ritual to accessing stored food. It reinforces patience. Winter teaches delayed gratification without using those words. You eat what is needed, not what is wanted. You think about how different this feels from modern storage where abundance often hides vulnerability. Here awareness stays close to the surface. Everyone knows roughly how much remains. That knowledge shapes behavior. Inside the shelter, the smell of food mingles with smoke and earth. It signals continuity. Winter has not stopped life. It has slowed it into something sustainable. Some interpretations suggest that food sharing during winter reinforced mutual dependence. Others emphasize household-level management. Both existed side by side. Individual responsibility operated within collective awareness. You imagine a child being handed a smaller portion without complaint. Hunger is understood, but trust matters more. Food will come again. The shelter and the stores have proven themselves before. As the night deepens, again caches remain sealed. Opening them too often risks spoilage. Restraint is part of survival. You settle back aware now that beneath the frozen surface around you lies another layer of protection. Not visible, not warm, but just as essential. The shelter above and the stores below form a vertical system of survival. Heat held in walls, food held in earth, people held in between. Outside, winter stretches endlessly. Inside, the future has been accounted for. You breathe slowly, comforted by the quiet confidence that comes from knowing tomorrow has already been prepared for. Your thoughts begin to wander beyond this single shelter, carried outward across frozen rivers, forests heavy with snow, open plains swept clean by wind. Winter does not look the same everywhere, yet it asks the same question in every place. How do you stay alive when the land shuts down? You imagine traveling slowly, season by season, across different regions. In the forests of the northeast, snow piles deep and stays. Trees offer materials and shelter, but movement becomes difficult. Farther west, winters can be dry and bitter, with cold that creeps rather than crashes. On the plains, wind dominates everything, flattening snow and stealing heat relentlessly. Each place demands a different answer. Shelters change as you move, shapes shift, materials adapt. The underlying logic remains steady. Reduce exposure, trap warmth, work with what is available rather than importing what is not. In wooded regions, bark becomes a major player. Flexible, layered, and surprisingly durable, it forms walls and roofs that shed snow efficiently. In areas where large trees are scarce, earth and grass take over, packed thickly into structures that hug the ground. In places where stone is plentiful, it is used carefully buffered with organic layers to prevent cold from leaching inward. You begin to sense how local knowledge shapes every choice. People know which materials rot quickly, which crack in cold, which hold moisture too long. Winter is an unforgiving teacher. Mistakes are remembered. You picture a traveller from one region stepping into a winter shelter from another. Familiar elements appear, but details differ. The entrance feels lower. The roof curves differently. The fire sits in another position. These differences are not arbitrary. They reflect the land's personality. One detail that stands out is how snow itself is treated differently across regions. In some places, deep snow becomes insulation and concealment. In others, wind prevents accumulation, so shelters rely more heavily on thick walls and strategic placement. The same material behaves differently depending on context. Inside each shelter, the rhythm of winter life adjusts accordingly. In harsher climates, movement slows further. Energy conservation becomes more pronounced. In milder regions, winter still restricts activity, but with more flexibility. Variation exists, but caution remains universal. There is no single blueprint for surviving winter. That is part of the lesson. Adaptation is local. What works in one valley may fail disastrously in another. Knowledge travels, but it is always tested against reality. You imagine stories being shared between communities during warmer months, observations about storms shelter, designs, food storage, techniques. Some ideas transfer well, others do not. Trial and error refine what stays. The shelters you have experienced so far begin to feel like members of a large family rather than identical copies. Each one speaks the language of its environment fluently. Inside your current shelter, this awareness adds depth. You realize you are sitting inside one solution among many shaped by a specific place and history. It does not claim to be universal, it claims to work here. As winter presses on, people trust what they know. They do not envy distant regions with different materials or methods. Familiarity breeds confidence. Winter rewards that confidence. You think about how often modern systems fail when removed from their intended context. Here everything is grounded, literally. Shelters grow out of the land they serve. Some interpretations emphasize innovation and exchange between regions, while others highlight long periods of localized development. Both processes leave traces. Winter shelters are not static traditions. They evolve slowly, absorbing new ideas when they prove useful. You feel comforted by this diversity. It suggests resilience on a continental scale. No single failure would erase all knowledge. Solutions existed everywhere, tailored to survive where they stood. Outside, the cold remains intense, but it feels less oppressive now. You understand it better. Winter is not a single enemy. It is many challenges layered together, each met with a specific response. Inside, warmth holds steady. The shelter does what it was built to do, shaped by generations who listened carefully to their environment. You close your eyes again, letting your mind drift across snowy landscapes and hidden homes beneath them. Different forms, same purpose. Everywhere people found ways to wait out the cold, quietly, thoughtfully, and together. You feel the character of winter change as your thoughts drift onto the open plains. The land stretches wide here with few trees to soften the wind and little terrain to hide behind. Cold moves fast across this space, pushed by gusts that never seem to rest. Standing above ground too long would drain warmth quickly, no matter how well you were dressed. Here winter shelters take on a different presence. They are larger, heavier, and deeply grounded. Earth lodges rise gently from the plains like extensions of the land itself. From a distance, they barely interrupt the horizon. Up close, they feel solid and deliberate, built to endure months of relentless cold. You imagine stepping inside one of these lodges during a blizzard. The entrance slopes downward, forcing you to lower your body, shedding wind and cold with every step. Inside, the space opens wide, supported by massive wooden posts arranged in a careful circle. The roof arches overhead, layered thick with grass soil and sometimes sod cuts straight from the prairie. The temperature shift is immediate. Wind noise fades to nothing. The air feels dense, held in place by walls that are feet thick. Fire burns low at the center, its warmth spreading outward, slowly absorbed by the earth around it. These lodges were not small family shelters. They housed entire households, sometimes dozens of people. Winter on the plains demanded cooperation on a larger scale. Isolation was dangerous when storms could erase tracks and landmarks in minutes. You notice how the walls curve inward, directing weight downward rather than outward. Snow piles high on top without threatening collapse. The roof is heavy by design. That weight seals gaps, blocks wind, and keeps warmth from escaping. Inside, daily life continues at a slower rhythm. Tools hang within reach. Food stores are tucked into protected alcoves. Sleeping areas ring the interior, raised slightly above the floor. Everyone has a place, and that place rarely changes during winter. There is a deep quiet here that feels different from forest shelters. Outside, the plains howl. Inside, the lodge absorbs that violence completely. It feels like stepping into the calm center of a storm. You sense how much labor went into building and maintaining this structure. Gathering timber on the plains required planning and coordination. Every beam mattered. Every joint was tested long before winter arrived. People move carefully inside, mindful of shared space. Fires are tended with restraint. Smoke rises through an opening above, steady and predictable. The lodge breathes slowly, just enough to stay safe. At night, the shelter feels even more solid. Darkness presses in from all sides, but the lodge holds its shape, its warmth, its people. Stories pass quietly. Laughter comes and goes. Winter is endured collectively, not individually. You imagine stepping outside briefly, the cold slamming into you instantly. The wind cuts through the clothing. Returning inside feels like relief at a deep physical level. The lodge does not just block winter, it reminds you what warmth feels like. As you settle back into stillness, the scale of the structure becomes comforting rather than overwhelming. Its mass is reassurance. Its presence says this land has been lived on long enough for people to learn how to wait out its worst moods. Outside, snow drifts endlessly across the plains. Inside, the earth lodge remains anchored steady and warm. You breathe slowly, knowing that even in the most exposed landscapes, people found ways to root themselves against the cold and stay. Your thoughts drift farther north now into a landscape where winter feels permanent rather than seasonal. The light behaves differently here. Days stretch long and pale or vanish almost entirely. The cold is sharper, cleaner, and utterly unapologetic. Trees thin out, then disappear. The ground hardens into something that feels less like soil and more like memory. Here shelters look nothing like what you've imagined so far, and yet the logic behind them feels instantly familiar. You picture blocks of snow stacked carefully, each one cut cleanly and placed with intention. From a distance, the structure seems fragile, almost temporary. Up close, it feels solid, quiet, and strangely welcoming. You step inside and are immediately struck by the stillness. Wind that screamed outside is suddenly gone. The interior feels hushed, insulated, calm. Snow underfoot does not crunch. It absorbs sound, swallowing it whole. Your breath slows without you telling it to. The temperature shift surprises you. It is not warm in the way a fire warmed earlier shelters, but it is stable. The biting edge is gone. The cold here feels contained, managed. Snow walls hold heat because of the air trapped within them, turning what looks like frozen nothingness into effective protection. You notice how light enters softly through the walls, diffused and gentle. There are no harsh shadows. Everything glows faintly blue and white. The effect is calming, almost dreamlike. The shelter feels like it exists slightly outside of time. Many people imagine these snow houses as crude emergency structures, something thrown together in desperation. That picture misses the reality entirely. Building one requires precision, experience, and patience. The wrong snow collapses. The wrong angle fails. Every cut matters. You crouch near the entrance, which dips lower than the main living space. Cold air settles there, away from where people sit and sleep. Warm air rises and stays put. This simple height difference creates a thermal pocket that makes long stays possible. Inside movement is minimal. Energy is conserved carefully. Fires are rare or non-existent. Instead, warmth comes from bodies, lamps fueled by animal fat and the shelter itself. Smoke is not part of the equation here. Air remains clean, dry, and breathable. There is a common misunderstanding that snow structures melt easily once occupied. In reality, Interior warmth causes the inner surface to harden into a thin layer of ice, strengthening the walls rather than weakening them. The shelter becomes more stable the longer it is used, as long as temperatures remain low. You rest your hand against the wall and feel its firmness. It does not crumble, it does not drip. It holds steady, responding to its environment rather than resisting it. Sleeping areas are raised slightly, just enough to stay within the warmest air. Bedding is thick-layered and dry. Moisture is carefully managed because dampness here is dangerous. Every habit is shaped by that understanding. You sense how quiet life becomes in this space. Sound feels unnecessary, even thought slows. The shelter encourages stillness. Winter here is not something to fill with activity, it is something to endure patiently. Stories passed down describe long nights spent listening to wind circle the shelter without touching it. The contrast between outside violence and inside calm becomes deeply reassuring. The structure is small, but its effect is immense. There are still questions about how long these shelters were occupied at a stretch. Some signs point to brief stays during travel. Others suggest longer periods when conditions demanded it. What remains clear is that they were never makeshift. They were deliberate answers to an extreme environment. You imagine stepping back outside the cold, instantly reclaiming you. The shelter behind you blends into the landscape, almost invisible. That invisibility is part of its success. It leaves no sharp edges for wind to exploit. As you return inside, you feel gratitude for the ingenuity that turned snow, the very symbol of cold, into protection against itself. The lesson echoes what you have already learned. Winter does not require domination, it requires understanding. You settle into the quiet again, surrounded by walls that glow faintly in the dim light. Outside, the frozen world continues endlessly. Inside, calm holds firm, shaped from the cold itself. The longer you stay inside winter shelters, the more you notice how sound itself changes. It is not just quieter, it is reshaped. Outside, winter is loud in its own way. Wind shrieks, ice cracks, huge trees groan under weight. Snow scrapes across itself like sand. Inside, all of that becomes distant, filtered, almost abstract. You sit still and listen. The shelter absorbs sharp noises and softens them into something rounded and harmless. Walls made of earth, snow, bark and fibre do not bounce sound back at you. They take it in. Even voices behave differently here. Words do not travel far, they settle quickly, staying close to the speaker. This changes how people speak. There is less need to raise a voice. Conversations become quieter by default. Laughter is softer, closer to breath than to sound. Silence stretches comfortably without feeling empty. You notice how the absence of noise affects your body. Your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclenches. Without constant external stimulation, your senses settle inward. Winter outside demands vigilance. Winter inside invites rest. At night, this effect deepens. Darkness and quiet work together. The shelter feels wrapped not just in insulation but in stillness. Even the fire sounds different, its crackle subdued, its rhythm steady. You become aware of subtle sounds you might otherwise miss. Breathing nearby, the faint shift of someone adjusting bedding, the soft scrape of a tool being moved gently rather than dropped. These sounds feel intimate rather than intrusive. Snow plays a major role here. It dampens sound as effectively as it traps heat. Thick layers outside the shelter turn storms into muted pressure rather than chaos. A blizzard that would be overwhelming in the open becomes a distant presence felt more than heard. You imagine lying awake during one of those storms listening to nothing at all? No howling, no pounding, just a heavy quiet pressing in from all sides. That silence can be unsettling at first, but it quickly becomes comforting. It means the shelter is doing its job. People learn to read sound carefully. A new whistle might signal a draft forming. A change in how smoke moves might hint at shifting wind. Quiet attention replaces constant alertness. The shelter reduces noise so that important changes stand out clearly. There is something deeply regulating about this environment. Modern studies talk about how reduced noise lowers stress and improves sleep. You do not need studies to feel that now. Your breathing has slowed, your thoughts drift more easily. You also notice how storytelling fits into this acoustic world. Voices stay low, stories unfold slowly. Dramatic gestures are unnecessary. Words are chosen carefully allowed to settle into the space. Storytelling becomes part of the shelter's rhythm, not a performance. Silence itself carries meaning. Pauses are not awkward, they are connected. Time stretches. No one rushes to fill gaps. Winter encourages patience and quiet reinforces it. You think about how different this is from modern environments filled with constant noise. Machines hum, screens buzz, silence is rare and often uncomfortable. Here, silence is normal. It signals safety. As sleep approaches, sound fades even further. The shelter holds everyone in a shared hush. Even dreams seem quieter, less frantic. Outside, winter continues its work. Inside, the absence of noise becomes another form of protection. Not against cold, but against exhaustion, against fear, against the constant edge of alertness. You rest in that quiet, letting it wrap around you as fully as any blanket. Winter does not feel so harsh when it cannot shout at you. As the quiet deepens, you begin to sense that these winter shelters are more than practical spaces. They carry meaning that settles in slowly, like warmth seeping into cold hands. You feel it in the way people move differently here, more gently, more deliberately, as if the space itself asks for a certain kind of behavior. The shelter becomes a place where the season is acknowledged rather than resisted. Winter is not treated as an enemy to defeat, but as a presence to be respected. This attitude shapes how time is spent inside. Activities slow, words become fewer but more considered. The shelter feels almost like a threshold between the human world and the wider forces outside. You imagine moments when people sit quietly listening, not to sound, but to absence. In these spaces, stillness has weight. It allows reflection. Long nights invite thought, memory, and story. Winter shelters hold more than bodies. They hold attention. Certain areas feel different from others. The hearth is not just a heat source. It is a center, a place where eyes naturally return. Entryways feel transitional places where outside energy is left behind. Sleeping areas feel inward protected, almost sacred in their calm. You notice how objects are arranged with care. Tools are not scattered. They have places. This order is not about neatness. It is about reducing effort and confusion when energy is limited. But it also creates a sense of calm. Visual simplicity mirrors mental quiet. Some traditions speak of winter as a time when the boundary between worlds feels thinner. Whether or not you believe that the shelter encourages inward focus, with fewer distractions, thoughts deepen. Stories connect past and present. Elders speak and others listen without interruption. You sense that winter shelters also served as classrooms of a different kind. Knowledge was shared here not through instruction but through proximity. Children learned by being present, absorbing patterns of behavior, tone, and response. Winter made teaching unavoidable by slowing everything else. The shelter feels protective in a way that goes beyond temperature. It shields people from the psychological strain of endless cold and darkness. Inside there is rhythm, fire tending, storytelling, rest. These routines anchor the mind. You imagine how important that this would have been during especially long winters. When storms lingered and travel stopped completely, the shelter became the whole world. Maintaining balance inside mattered as much as maintaining warmth. There is a sense that these spaces were treated with respect. Not reverence in a formal sense, but awareness. Damage was repaired quickly, cleanliness was maintained, disorder was minimized, the shelter was not taken for granted. You notice how your own posture shifts as you sit here longer. Shoulders drop, breathing evens out, you become quieter without trying. The space guides behavior gently. Winter shelters remind you that survival is not only physical, it is mental and emotional. Long isolation can wear people down. These spaces counter that by creating shared focus and meaning. Outside, winter stretches on vast and impersonal. Inside, the shelter creates a human scale. It turns months into manageable moments, night into rest rather than fear. As the fire dims, shadows soften. The shelter holds its shape and its purpose. It is a place of waiting but not emptiness, waiting filled with presence. You settle into that feeling, letting the deeper warmth take hold. Winter is still there, but it no longer feels overwhelming. The shelter has transformed it into something that can be lived with quietly, patiently, and together. As the night continues, your awareness shifts again, this time towards the quiet labour that shaped everything around you. You begin to notice patterns that point to hands often overlooked knowledge, carried without announcement. The shelter feels intentional in ways that suggest long familiarity, rather than sudden invention. You picture the work happening before winter arrived, measuring with the body rather than tools, testing thickness by touch, knowing how tightly to pack earth so it holds heat without cracking. Much of this knowledge lived in daily practice, passed along during ordinary tasks rather than formal instruction. Inside the shelter, you see how spaces are arranged for efficiency and care. Sleeping areas positioned where warmth lingers longest. Storage placed within easy reach but never in the way. Fire tools kept close but not scattered. These choices reflect someone who understands how movement slows in winter and plans accordingly. You imagine people working together, sharing responsibility for maintenance. Repairs are quiet and constant. A crack filled before it grows. A draft blocked before it chills the whole space. This attentiveness keeps winter from gaining small advantages that could grow dangerous over time. Clothing, bedding, walls, and routines form a single system. Someone had to understand how each part interacted. Too much insulation in one place could trap moisture. Too little in another could leak heat. Balance mattered more than excess. You notice how the shelter adapts subtly across the season. As winter deepens, arrangements tighten. As light returns, slowly spaces relax again. These adjustments are not dramatic. They're incremental, guided by feel rather than rule. There is a quiet confidence in how everything fits together. It suggests generations of refinement rather than a single moment of inspiration. Knowledge accumulates, slowly shaped by outcomes, remembered vividly. You think about how often this kind of expertise goes unrecognized in historical accounts. Practical knowledge rarely announces itself. It leaves few written records. It exists in the survival of families and the continuity of routines in shelters that did not fail. Inside the shelter, you feel held by that accumulated care. Nothing here feels accidental. Even imperfections seem intentional, allowing flexibility rather than rigidity. The night grows deeper. People shift less. The fire rests low. The shelter does not need constant attention now. It has been prepared well enough to hold through hours of stillness. You sense a quiet pride in this space, not loud or boastful, but steady. The pride of something that works because it understands its purpose. As sleep pulls closer, you realize that winter survival depended as much on thoughtful design as on strength or endurance. The shelter is proof of that. It is shaped by patience, observation, and care repeated across lifetimes. You settle back, breathing evenly, feeling the shelter do its work without asking anything of you in return. You feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not in temperature but in tension. It arrives quietly, like a change in pressure before a storm. The shelter is the same, the fire burns as it always has, but something else has entered the story, something carried on unfamiliar footsteps and new assumptions about how winter should be faced. You imagine the first encounters, outsiders arriving during colder months, wrapped in heavy fabrics that soak through and freeze, struggling to keep fires alive, in structures never meant to hold heat efficiently. They look at these winter shelters and misunderstand what they are seeing. Low profiles read as primitive. Earth walls look temporary. Snow-covered roofs appear abandoned. From the inside, the contrast is stark. One way of surviving winter is loud, resource-hungry, and constantly at war with the cold. The other is quiet, restrained, and patient. When these worlds meet, confusion follows. You sense how changes begin slowly. New materials appear, new rules are imposed. Some shelters are discouraged or dismantled, replaced by buildings that look more familiar to outsiders but perform poorly in the environment they are dropped into. Heat escapes upward, wind slips through joints, fuel consumption rises sharply. Inside the shelter, people adapt as they always have. They add layers, they reinforce walls, they adjust routines. But the pressure is different now. It does not come from winter itself, but from expectations imposed from elsewhere. You imagine elders watching this shift with concern. Knowledge that once guided winter survival is questioned or ignored. Techniques refined over generations are dismissed as backward. Yet when storms arrive, it is the old shelters that remain calm and warm, while new structures creak and fail. Some families maintain winter practices quietly out of sight. Shelters become more hidden, less visible, on the land special. What was once ordinary becomes something to protect from interference. Survival moves underground again, not just physically but culturally. You feel how this affects the rhythm of winter life. Movement becomes cautious in new ways. Decisions carry added weight. The shelter is no longer just protection from cold, but from disruption. There are moments of exchange too. Not all encounters are dismissive. Some outsiders observe closely, learn and adapt. Techniques spread unevenly. Earth walls appear beneath wooden frames. Snow insulation is adopted quietly. Fire management improves where people pay attention. Inside the shelter, winter remains winter. Cold still demands respect. Storms still arrive without warning. The shelter does its work regardless of who believes in it. You notice how resilience takes a new form. It is no longer just about enduring the season. It is about preserving knowledge under pressure. The shelter becomes a vessel for memory as much as warmth. Time stretches. Winters come and go. Some practices fade. Others endure because they continue to work. The land remains the final judge. Structures that fail are abandoned. Those that hold are returned to again and again. You feel a quiet sadness layered over the calm. Loss exists here, but it does not overwhelm. What survives does so because it is useful, not because it is defended loudly. Inside the shelter still feels grounded. Earth walls remain patient. Snow still insulates. Fire still warms. The fundamentals do not change easily. As you rest, you sense how winter shelters became places of continuity during times of upheaval. Even as the world shifted above ground beneath the surface, warmth and care persisted. The night deepens. Outside forces feel distant again. Inside the shelter holds what it always has. Heat, memory, the quiet determination to endure another winter no matter who's watching. You feel the shelter respond to pressure in ways that are almost imperceptible unless you stay long enough to notice. Not pressure from snow or wind, but from change. Seasons still turn. Storms still arrive. Yet the world beyond the shelter has shifted, and winter life has learned to bend without breaking. Inside, adaptation happens quietly. Materials change first. New fabrics appear alongside old ones. Some are heavier, some lighter, some less forgiving when damp. People test them carefully, wearing them indoors, sleeping in them, learning their limits before trusting them outside. Anything that steals warmth too quickly is set aside. Shelter walls show similar experimentation. A new plank added here, an old layer kept beneath it. Earth still pressed tight against anything unfamiliar, as if to anchor it. The shelter absorbs what works and rejects what does not, without debate or announcement. You notice how routines adjust. Fire tending shifts slightly to account for different fuels. Smoke openings are altered, narrowed, widened, reshaped. Someone notices condensation forming where it never used to. That spot is watched closely. Moisture is not tolerated. A small change can become a big problem if ignored. Winter continues to demand attention and the shelter continues to answer. It does not freeze in time. It evolves, but slowly, deliberately, always tested against cold reality rather than new ideas alone. You imagine a particularly harsh winter following a period of disruption. New rules, new expectations, some familiar practices restricted or discouraged. When storms arrive, it becomes clear which habits were essential and which were negotiable. The shelter remembers what mattered. People respond by blending approaches. A wooden frame might rise where an earth wall once stood, but soil is still packed thickly around it. A metal tool replaces a stone one, but fire is still kept low and patient. Change is filtered through experience. You feel how resilience shifts from pure tradition to careful selection. Nothing is adopted just because it is new. Nothing is discarded just because it is old. Winter remains the measuring stick. Inside the shelter, life continues its slow rhythm. Sleep, food, quiet conversation. Children learn without realizing they are learning. Elders adapt to adjusting advice, refining memory. Knowledge stays alive by staying useful. You sense tension sometimes, but it never dominates. The cold outside remains a stronger force than disagreement inside. Survival aligns priorities, and just quickly. There are moments when older shelters are rebuilt entirely not because they failed, but because materials changed or access shifted. Even then, certain shapes return: low entrances, thick walls, curved surfaces, snow-friendly forms. These elements persist because they work. You notice how people become more intentional about concealment again. Shelters blend more deeply into the land. Earth tones, snow cover encouraged, visibility reduced. What once was ordinary becomes protective. Inside, warmth feels slightly different now, shaped by a mix of materials and habits. Yet the calm remains. The shelter still softens sound, still slows breathing, still invites rest. You realize that adaptation under pressure is not loud or dramatic, it is incremental. A small adjustment one winter, another the next. Over time, shelters reflect layers of history embedded in their walls. Outside, winter shows no interest in human debates or changes. It continues with the same indifference it always has. Inside, people respond with the same quiet focus they always have. You settle deeper into the space, feeling the shelter hold steady despite everything layered into it. Past and present coexist here not as conflict but as accumulated wisdom. The night grows long again, till snow presses gently, fire glows faintly, the shelter breathes. What endures is not any single method or material, but the willingness to observe, adjust, and protect what matters. Winter has always rewarded that. You close your eyes aware that survival here has never been about standing still. It has always been about knowing when to shift and how little needs to change to make all the difference. You begin to sense how time leaves its marks even when nothing obvious remains. Winter shelters rarely survive intact once they are no longer used. Roofs sink, walls slump, materials return quietly to the land they came from, and yet traces linger subtle enough that you have to know how to look. You imagine standing on a snow-free hillside centuries later, unaware that life once pulsed beneath your feet. The ground looks ordinary. A slight rise here, a shallow depression there. Nothing dramatic, but beneath the surface patterns wait patiently. When people dig carefully in places like this, they uncover stories written in soil. Darkened patches where fires once burned. Rings of packed earth that once formed walls. Post holes aligned with deliberate spacing, ash layers laid down year after year. These are not accidents, they are fingerprints. You picture someone kneeling in the cold earth, brushing dirt away, slowly revealing a hearthstone, smoothed by countless tending hands. The fire is long gone, but its presence still shapes the ground. Heat changes soil, smoke leaves residue. Winter shelters announce themselves quietly to those who listen. Food remains tell their own story. Bones fractured in consistent ways, seeds clustered where storage once existed. These details reveal winter habits more clearly than words ever could. What people ate, how they prepared it, how carefully they rationed all of it, sits preserved in layers. You notice how often winter sites show repeated use. One shelter built atop the remains of another, then another. Slight shifts in placement but the same general location. This tells you that the land itself earned trust. People returned because it worked before. Sometimes the ground shows signs of emergency repair. Extra layers of soil added suddenly. Fire pits reshaped mid-season. These moments hint at winters that tested even the best designs. The shelter adapted and the evidence stayed behind. You imagine how much knowledge is invisible now. Organic materials decay completely. Bark grass hides and wood vanish over time. What remains is partial and incomplete. Interpreting it requires imagination guided by restraint. Too much certainty would be dishonest. Too little would miss the point. You feel how different this is from studying grand stone structures that shout their purpose. Winter shelters whisper. They ask for patience. They reward careful attention. The land itself becomes a record keeper. Freeze and thaw cycles preserve some things and erase others. Soil chemistry locks certain traces in place. Snowmelt rearranges small details but leaves larger patterns intact. You think about how many winter shelters were never documented at all. How many lives were lived entirely beneath notice, their warmth and care, leaving only faint impressions. Survival does not demand permanence. Standing here in your imagination, you sense continuity rather than loss. The shelters did their job. They kept people alive. That was their purpose. Lasting forever was never part of the plan. Even now, the earth remembers enough to tell the story to those who approach gently. It does not give everything away. It does not need to. You return in thought to the shelter you've been resting in. Warm, quiet, temporary. It feels right that it will one day disappear without drama. Winter shelters were never about being seen by the future. They were about carrying people through the present. The traces left behind are enough. You breathe slowly, aware that history often survives in subtle forms, in darkened soil, in quiet patterns, in places where warmth once gathered against the cold and then moved on. You find yourself thinking about how much of what you have experienced here cannot be pinned down to a single explanation. Winter shelters resist neat conclusions. They are layered with decisions made by different hands at different times under different pressures. Trying to reduce them to one method or one idea feels wrong, like flattening something that was meant to stay textured. You imagine people talking quietly inside a shelter long ago, comparing experiences from different winters. One remembers a roof that held beautifully under heavy snow. Another recalls a wall that cracked after a sudden thaw. These memories do not become rules written down anywhere. They become instincts, preferences, subtle adjustments made the next time a shelter is built. Over time, variations emerge. Some walls are thicker than others. Some roofs slope more steeply. Some entrances turn sharply before opening into the main space. Each choice reflects a response to something that happened before, even if the reason is no longer spoken aloud. When you look back across different regions and time periods of days, these variations can be puzzling. Why build deeper here and shallower there? Why favour one material when another seems equally available? The answers are rarely obvious. They sit somewhere between environment, habit, and memory. You imagine someone shaping a shelter and trusting their hands more than any plan. They press the earth and feel whether it is right. They adjust the angle of a beam because it looks better that way, because it feels more stable. Experience guides decisions faster than explanation ever could. This is why interpretations shift over time. New evidence appears. Old assumptions are challenged. A feature once thought symbolic reveals a practical purpose. Something assumed to be purely functional turns out to carry meaning. Winter shelters do not offer simple answers because they were never simple solutions. You feel this complexity in the shelter around you. Nothing screams its purpose. Everything works quietly. The design does not call attention to itself. It simply holds. You think about how tempting it is to search for a single origin story, a moment when someone first figured out how to survive winter this way. But survival rarely works like that. It accumulates. It layers. It improves through repetition rather than invention. Inside the shelter, this layered knowledge feels reassuring. It means no one depended on a single idea that could fail catastrophically. Redundancy exists everywhere. Multiple layers, multiple strategies. If one part underperforms, another compensates. You notice how this approach mirrors the season itself. Winter is not one thing. It is cold wind, Darkness, isolation, hunger, and unpredictability combined. A single solution would never be enough. The shelter answers winter with complexity rather than force. As you rest, your thoughts wander through the possibilities. Perhaps some features began as practical responses and later took on meaning. Perhaps others began as expressions of belief and proved useful enough to keep. The line between purpose and interpretation blurs. You realize that this uncertainty does not weaken the story. It strengthens it. It reflects a way of living that valued observation over certainty, responsiveness over rigid planning. The shelter around you feels like the result of many conversations across time, not spoken all at once, but carried forward in choices that worked and were repeated. Winter after winter, those choices were tested again. You sense a quiet humility in this, no claim to mastery over nature, just ongoing negotiation. When winter changed, shelters changed with it. When something failed, it was adjusted rather than defended. Outside, the cold remains indifferent. Inside, people adapt. That contrast feels important. You breathe slowly, letting the complexity settle rather than trying to resolve it. Some things are not meant to be neatly explained, they are meant to be lived. The shelter holds you without demanding understanding. It does not need justification. It only needs to keep doing what it has always done. As your thoughts slow, you accept that some questions will remain open. That is not a flaw. It is a reminder that survival knowledge grows best when it stays flexible, attentive, and unfinished. You drift deeper into rest, surrounded by a space shaped by many winters, many hands, and many small decisions that added up to warmth, safety, and another night lived through the cold. You begin to sense how familiar this all feels, even though centuries separate you from the people who first learned these lessons. The shelter around you is quiet, steady, and patient. It makes you think about the way modern buildings often fail in extreme cold despite all the technology layered into them. Drafts creep in through places no one thought to check. Heat rises and disappears into empty ceilings. Energy is spent loudly, constantly, and still feels insufficient. Here nothing is wasted. Every surface participates. Every shape has a reason, even if that reason was learned through cold fingers and long nights rather than calculations. You realize that many of these winter shelters solved problems that still challenge builders today, using observation instead of abstraction. You picture a modern house dropped into this landscape. Tall walls, large windows, sharp corners. It looks impressive, but winter strips away that confidence quickly. Wind finds leverage. Snow piles where it should not. Heating systems strain to compensate for designs that ignore the land rather than respond to it. The shelter you are resting in does the opposite. It keeps its profile low. It avoids fighting gravity. It welcomes snow instead of rejecting it. Warm air is encouraged to stay. Cold air is gently guided away. The structure behaves like part of the environment rather than an interruption. You feel how the curved walls soften pressure, how the earth beneath you stabilizes temperature, how the entrance slows the transition between outside and inside. These are ideas modern designers talk about again, now using different words, rediscovering principles that were already lived here. You imagine someone today trying to replicate this without understanding it fully. They copy the shape but miss the placement. They use modern materials without accounting for moisture. They add insulation without ventilation. The result looks right, but feels wrong. Warmth becomes uneven, air grows stale, comfort slips away. The difference lies in attention. These winter shelters were not designed once and repeated blindly. They were adjusted every season. If something felt off, it was changed. If a wall stayed damp, it was rebuilt. If smoke lingered, openings were reshaped. Feedback was immediate and unavoidable. Modern systems often separate design from experience. Someone far away decides how a building should behave. Someone else lives inside the consequences. Here, those roles were never separate. Builders were occupants. Occupants were maintainers. The shelter taught through use. You begin to see how this approach could still matter. Cold climates have not disappeared. Winters still test structures and systems. Yet many solutions rely on added complexity rather than refined simplicity. More machines, more energy, more points of failure. The shelter around you has almost none of that. Its strength comes from reduction rather than addition. Fewer openings, fewer materials, fewer decisions that need constant correction. You run your hand along the wall again. It's not perfectly smooth. Small variations remain. Those variations allow the structure to respond rather than resist. Rigidity breaks. Flexibility endures. You think about insulation ratings and energy efficiency charts. They try to quantify comfort, but comfort here is felt, not measured. You know when it is right because your body relaxes, your breathing slows, you stop thinking about the cold. Outside, winter continues unchanged. Inside, you are unaware of it most of the time. That is the goal. Not to overpower winter, but to forget it long enough to rest. You imagine future builders standing in this same place centuries later, trying to understand why the ground feels different to here, why snow settles oddly, why the land seems to cradle heat. If they listened carefully, the shelter would still be teaching. There is humility in this design philosophy. It does not assume mastery over nature. It assumes partnership. When conditions change, the shelter changes. When mistakes are made, they are corrected quietly. You feel how that mindset contrasts with the urge to dominate environments rather than adapt to them. Winter punishes that urge relentlessly. The cold does not negotiate. It simply reveals weaknesses. As you settle deeper into stillness, you realize that the lesson here is not nostalgic or sentimental. It is practical. These shelters work because they paid attention, they observed, they responded. The warmth around you is proof of that. It is not dramatic, it is steady. It does not fluctuate wildly, it does not demand constant input, it simply holds. You let your eyes close again, comforted by the idea that some knowledge doesn't need rediscovery. It waits quietly beneath the surface in earth shape just right, in walls that curve instead of resist, in entrances that slow you down and invite you inside gently. Winter shelters solved problems by listening carefully to winter itself. That conversation never really ended. It just grew quieter, waiting for someone to notice again. You breathe in slowly, feeling the shelter support you without effort. Outside, the cold remains absolute. Inside, you are warm enough to forget it exists, and that may be the most elegant solution of all. As the night moves deeper, your thoughts drift toward winters that tested even the most prepared shelters. Not ordinary cold seasons, but the ones remembered long after the ones people spoke about in quieter voices. These winters left impressions that outlasted the snow itself. You imagine elders sitting close to the fire, recalling a year when the cold arrived early and refused to leave. The first freeze came before repairs were finished. Snow fell heavier than expected. Game moved differently. Familiar signs failed. These memories were not shared to frighten, but to prepare. Winter stories carried instruction wrapped in experience. Inside the shelter, those stories felt different than they would outdoors. The walls held warmth and sound, making the memories feel contained rather than overwhelming. Listening here, you could absorb the lesson without panic. The shelter created emotional insulation alongside physical protection. You picture one of those severe winters unfolding slowly. At first, routines continue as usual. Fires burn low, food stores are opened carefully. But as weeks pass, adjustments become necessary. Portions shrink slightly, movement slows further. Extra layers appear on walls and floors. The shelter tightens around its people. Traces of such winters sometimes remain visible long after. Thicker ash layers, additional wall reinforcements added mid-season, storage pits emptied more completely than usual. These marks tell stories of endurance rather than failure. You notice how memory shapes behavior long before conditions repeat themselves. A winter remembered as harsh leads to earlier preparation next time. More food stored, roofs reinforced just a little extra, entrances buffered more carefully. Past difficulty becomes future readiness. Inside the shelter, these remembered winters influence tone. There is less complaining, more quiet checking on one another. Small gestures of care increase. Someone adjusts a blanket sooner. Someone shares food without comment. Survival during extreme cold depends as much on cooperation as on construction. You imagine nights when storms lasted for days, snow piling so high that the entrance had to be dug out repeatedly. Each clearing was done carefully conserving energy, avoiding sweat that would chill later. The shelter became both refuge and task, something that demanded attention, but gave safety in return. Stories of these winters often included moments of uncertainty. A fire nearly dying, a roof sagging under unexpected weight, a thaw followed by sudden freeze. These moments were remembered not for drama, but for what was learned. Each close call refined future response. You sense how the shelter becomes a repository for these lessons. It is not just built once, it is adjusted based on remembered winters. The walls grow thicker where storms proved worst. Drainage improves where meltwater once pooled. Knowledge accumulates quietly in soil and structure. You realize that extreme winters did not break these systems. They tested them. Weaknesses were exposed then addressed. Shelters that failed were rebuilt differently. Ones that held became templates returned to again and again. Inside the presence of such memories creates calm rather than fear. People know winter can be severe, but they also know they have survived it before. The shelter stands as proof. You feel this confidence in the way the space holds you now, and nothing feels rushed. There is no sense of impending crisis. Even if the storm outside worsens, the shelter has margin. It has been shaped by winters that demanded more than this. As the fire glows softly, you imagine listening to a story about a winter so cold that breath froze inside shelters if fires burned too low. The story is not exaggerated. It is shared simply with pauses, allowing listeners to absorb the seriousness without panic. Children hear these stories and learn what matters, not bravado, not strength alone, preparation, attention, sharing. These lessons settle in long before they are needed. The shelter feels different when you understand this history. It feels thicker somehow, heavier with experience. You're not just warm because of materials. You're warm because people paid attention when things went wrong and changed accordingly. Outside winter remains capable of extremes, that truth is never denied. Inside, however, that truth is met with readiness rather than fear. You rest more deeply now knowing that this shelter is the result of winters that pushed hard and were answered thoughtfully. It is not fragile optimism. It is confidence earned through repetition. As sleep pulls closer, the remembered winters fade into background understanding. They do not intrude. They reassure. They whisper that even when winter does its worst, survival is possible with patience, care, and a place built to hold both warmth and memory. You breathe evenly, letting those stories settle into the walls around you. The night continues, the shelter remains, and winter, no matter how severe, waits outside while you rest within. Morning never arrives suddenly in winter. It seeps in slowly, almost reluctantly, and even then it does not pull people from rest the way summer light does. Inside the shelter, routines continue in a softened form shaped by cold and darkness into something quieter and more deliberate. You notice how the day begins without urgency. No one leaps up, no one rushes outside, movements start small. Someone feeds the fire just enough to wake it. Someone else stretches carefully, joints stiff from the night. Breath fogs briefly, then fades as warmth gathers again. Daily life inside the shelter follows a rhythm that feels suspended in time. Tasks are chosen not for productivity but for necessity. Tools are repaired slowly. Clothing is mended with steady hands. Small items are reshaped, sharpened, improved. Winter is when maintenance happens, when things are made ready for the seasons ahead. You sit and watch how space is shared without discussion. People know where to sit, where to work, where to rest. Paths through the shelter are instinctive. No furniture needs moving, no instructions are given. The arrangement has been learned over many winters. Food preparation is careful and unhurried. Portions are warmed, not cooked elaborately. Fuel is conserved. Smells remain gentle. Nothing competes with the shelter's calm. Children occupy themselves quietly. They listen more than they speak. Winter teaches patience without explanation. Games are small, contained and creative. A piece of string, a carved object, a story whispered and repeated. Energy is spent thoughtfully. You notice how elders remain central, not because of authority, but because of continuity. Their presence anchors the day. Advice is offered casually, woven into conversation rather than delivered formally. Winter allows time for this kind of transmission. The shelter itself participates in the routine. Walls release warmth slowly through the day. Snow outside reflects light inward, keeping the interior gently illuminated without glare. Sound remains muted, even footsteps feel softer. You realize that winter life here is not empty or stagnant, it is concentrated. Fewer actions happen, but each one matters more. The shelter creates a world scale to what the season allows. Occasionally someone steps outside, briefly checking conditions, gathering snow for water, clearing the entrance if needed. Each trip is purposeful. Lingering outside is avoided. Cold is respected, not challenged. When that person returns, the shelter closes around them again. Warmth restores circulation. Cold is released at the threshold and does not follow them in. This transition happens many times through winter, always the same, always deliberate. As the day moves on, light shifts but never fully brightens. Evening arrives early, blending into night without a clear boundary. Inside the routine loops gently back toward rest. You feel how the shelter supports this cycle. It does not demand adaptation every hour. It stays consistent, allowing people to match its pace. By the time everyone settles again, the day feels complete despite how little happened by the modern standards. Winter redefines what counts as a full day. Survival itself becomes accomplishment enough. You rest back into the familiar quiet, aware now that winter shelters were not just for enduring storms. They were places where daily life slowed into something sustainable, repetitive, and quietly meaningful. Outside, darkness deepens again. Inside, the rhythm continues steady and unbroken, carrying everyone gently from one cold night to the next. As another night settles in, you begin to feel something that goes beyond warmth or shelter. It is the sense of being held by others, not physically alone, but through shared presence. Winter sharpens this feeling. Isolation becomes dangerous, while closeness becomes protective in ways that are easy to feel and hard to explain. You notice how people naturally gravitate toward one another as temperatures drop further. No one announces it. Bodies simply draw closer, blankets overlap, shoulders touch. Heat moves between people quietly, efficiently. This shared warmth is not accidental. It is one of the oldest forms of survival. Inside the shelter space contracts without feeling tight. Personal boundaries soften. What matters most now is staying warm, staying aware, staying together. The shelter encourages this by design. There are no private rooms, no hard divisions. Everything here invites proximity. You feel how conversation changes in this environment. Words are fewer, but they carry more weight. A brief comment can convey reassurance. A shared glance can say enough. Winter pares communication down to what is necessary and sincere. There is comfort in knowing that someone else will notice if you shift restlessly, if your breathing changes, if you pull your blanket tighter than usual. Care becomes mutual and continuous, not scheduled or assigned. You imagine how frightening winter would be alone. The cold nights, the silence, the constant need to monitor fire and food without relief. Inside the shelter, that burden is shared. Responsibility rotates, attention overlaps, no one carries everything by themselves. This closeness is not sentimental, it is practical. When bodies share, heat fuel lasts longer. When people rest in shifts, vigilance improves. When food is shared, risk spreads rather than concentrates. The shelter amplifies these benefits by keeping everyone within reach. You notice how the emotional tone remains steady even when winter stretches long. There is less anxiety than you might expect. Not because danger is absent, but because it is faced together. Fear loses its sharp edge when it is shared. You think about how modern life often emphasizes independence even in harsh conditions. Here winter makes independence impractical. Survival depends on interdependence. The shelter is built to support that truth. As the fire glows low, shadows gather softly around clustered forms. The light reveals closeness without spotlighting anyone. No one is singled out. Everyone is included in the same pool of warmth and dimness. You hear a soft laugh, brief and quiet. It passes through the space without disrupting it. Even joy adjusts to winter, becoming smaller but not disappearing. Rest comes easier when you are not guarding every moment alone. Someone else is awake. Someone else is listening. You can let go without fear that everything depends on you. The shelter feels fuller now, not because more people have entered, but because attention has settled. Everyone is present in the same way. Winter demands that kind of presence. You sense how this shared survival creates bonds that last beyond the season. People who endure winter together understand one another differently. Trust deepens. Memory forms around these nights, these shelters, these quiet acts of care. As sleep deepens, bodies adjust subtly, maintaining warmth without waking fully. The shelter holds these movements, gently absorbing, sound-smoothing transitions. Outside, winter remains vast and indifferent. Inside, it is reduced to something manageable through closeness. You breathe slowly, feeling the warmth not just from walls and earth, but from shared life around you. Winter is still here, but it is no longer something you face alone. The shelter becomes a circle of quiet endurance, and within that circle, the cold loses its power to isolate. You drift deeper into rest, held by shared warmth, steady breathing, and the simple truth that together is warmer than apart. As the season slowly begins to loosen its grip, you feel a subtle change in the shelter. Not warmth exactly, but a softening. The cold still arrives each night, still sharp and serious, but it no longer feels endless. Light lingers a little longer. The air carries hints of movement beyond snow and ice. You notice how people respond to this shift without naming it. Routines begin to stretch. Someone spends a little more time near the entrance listening. Someone steps outside more often, checking the land, not just for danger, but for signs of return. Winter is still present, but it is no longer absolute. Inside the shelter holds the accumulated memory of the season. Walls darkened slightly by smoke. Floors smoothed by the constant movement, tools worn into familiar shapes. These marks are not damage, they are evidence of use of endurance. You imagine conversations drifting toward what comes next. Quiet plans for repairs when the ground softens, thoughts of travel routes reopening. The shelter becomes a place of transition, not just protection. It has carried everyone through the hardest part. Now it begins to release them gently. You feel how care shifts from holding tight to preparing to loosen. Food stores are checked again, this time with cautious optimism. There is enough to last until the land offers something new. Firewood is still used carefully, but with less tension. You sense a change in posture. People stand a little straighter. Movements become slightly quicker. Energy begins to return, though it is still guarded. Winter has taught restraint, and that lesson is not abandoned easily. The shelter adapts to this phase too. Entrances open a little wider during the day. Smoke holes are adjusted to allow more light. Bedding is aired briefly when weather allows, then returned to place. The structure breathes differently as conditions change. You realize that these shelters were never meant to trap people indefinitely. They were meant to carry them safely through a specific moment. Knowing when to leave is as important as knowing how to stay. Outside, the snow begins to change texture. It softens during the day, refreezes at night. Water moves beneath the surface again. The land wakes slowly, carefully, as if testing whether it is safe. You imagine the shelter from above still blending into the landscape, still quiet, but now holding people who are beginning to look outward again. The inward focus of winter does not disappear, but it relaxes. There is a gentle gratitude in the air, not expressed loudly, but felt. The shelter did its job. It held, it protected. It allowed life to continue without drama. That is no small thing. You notice how some objects are already being set aside. Winter tools cleaned and placed where they can rest. Certain layers folded carefully, not discarded but stored with respect. Winter will return. It always does. You feel a sense of continuity rather than ending. The shelter is not abandoned abruptly. It is eased out of. Its presence lingers even as use changes. Some shelters will be repaired and reused. Others will be allowed to return to the land their work complete. As you rest here, you understand that what endures is not the structure itself, but the knowledge embedded in it. The understanding of how to meet winter without panic, how to prepare, how to wait, how to adjust. Outside the land shifts again, subtly signaling that movement will soon be possible. Inside, people are ready, not rushing, not lingering unnecessarily. You take one last deep breath of the shelter's air. Earth smoke, warmth, memory. It has shaped you quietly, taught you patience without instruction. As the night settles again, softer than before, you feel a calm confidence. Winter did not defeat anyone here. It was endured, respected, and eventually released. You let yourself rest into that feeling, knowing that this place will always exist in memory, even after its physical form fades. The shelter remains as an idea, a pattern of care and attention that can be carried anywhere. Outside, the season continues its slow turn. Inside, you are ready for what comes next, grounded by what has already been survived. You drift towards sleep, aware that the hardest part is behind you and the shelter, faithful and quiet, has already begun to let you go. You sense the final shift not as an event, but as a release. The shelter does not announce it. It simply loosens its hold. The walls remain steady, the earth still packed firm, but something in the air has changed. Winter is no longer pressing inward. It is beginning to withdraw. Light reaches the interior more easily now, lingering longer along the curved walls. Smoke thins more quickly when the fire is fed. The cold still arrives at night, but it no longer feels relentless. It feels temporary, manageable. You notice how people respond almost unconsciously. They sit closer to the entrance during the day. They listen more often to sounds outside. Footsteps crunching differently. Water moving beneath ice. Birds returning cautiously, one sound at a time. The shelter, which once felt like the entire world, now feels like a center point rather than a boundary. It has done its work. It carried everyone through the narrowest part of the year, through darkness, cold and stillness. Now it prepares to step back. You imagine people checking the walls, not for weakness, but with quiet appreciation. These surfaces held heat, absorbed sound, softened fear. They were never meant to last forever. They were meant to last long enough. Some shelters will be used again next winter. Others will be left behind, allowed to settle, to sink, to return to the land. This is not abandonment. It is completion. A shelter that no longer needs to be occupied has fulfilled its purpose. You feel a surprising tenderness toward this place. It has been constant when everything else was hostile. It has asked for very little in return, some maintenance, some attention, some respect. As people begin to spend more time outside, the shelter remains quiet, holding warmth without complaint. It does not resist the change. It does not cling. It simply exists, steady and patient, until it is no longer needed. You realize that this is the final lesson winter shelters offer. Survival is not about permanence. It is about timing, knowing when to hold tight, knowing when to loosen, knowing when to stay, knowing when to move on. The knowledge carried here does not disappear when the shelter empties. It travels with the people who lived inside it. It shows up in how they read the land, how they prepare, how they build again when the cold returns. Outside, the snow thins, patches of earth reappear. The land breathes differently. Inside, the shelter grows quieter, not from danger, but from transition. You take in the space one last time, the curve of the walls, the smoothness of the floor, the scent of smoke embedded gently into everything. These details will linger in memory long after the structure itself fades. You understand now why so many of these shelters left so little behind. They were not meant to be remembered as objects. They were meant to be remembered as experiences, as warmth held against impossible cold, as care practiced daily, as patience learned slowly. As night arrives again softer and shorter than before, you feel no urgency. The shelter has prepared you well. Winter has done what it needed to do, and now it is easing away. You let your breathing slow, your body heavy and relaxed. The shelter releases you gently, not pushing you forward, but trusting that you know when it's time. And as you rest here between seasons, you carry the quiet certainty that no matter how fierce winter becomes, people have always found ways to meet it with intelligence, restraint, and care. That knowledge remains steady as the earth itself. Wind down now, everything softens. The images grow quieter, slower, less defined, like breath fog fading into cold air. You no longer need to picture walls or fire or snow in detail. You've already felt them. They have already done their work. The shelter rests, and so do you. Your body knows what warmth feels like now. Not sharp heat, not urgency, but the kind that settles in gently and stays. The kind that allows muscles to loosen without effort. The kind that makes thoughts drift rather than race. Winter feels far away, even if the night outside your own window is cold and seas. You're not exposed. You're held. By memory, by understanding, by the quiet knowledge that people have faced far harsher nights than this and found calm within them. Breathing slows, the world narrows. Nothing asks anything of you. You do not need to solve winter. You do not need to prepare. You do not need to stay alert. All of that has already been done. Let the shelter fade now, not disappearing but becoming part of a deeper background. Earth returning to earth. Snow melting quietly, fire cooling into memory. You're safe, you're warm enough, you can rest. Thoughts can come and go without grabbing your attention. Images can blur. Sounds can soften. The story does not need to continue because it has already carried you where you need to be. So let your breathing deepen. Let your shoulders sink. Let the quiet hold. Sweet dreams.